You really wouldn't think something that looks like this would be a big deal in the NFL and maybe even causing some coaches and some players a little stress, but it is. I'm Tim, and let's talk Saints. So, what you're looking at here is kind of a diagram of the new NFL kickoff return rule. It's kind of picking up a little bit interest in the media and the coaches that have talked about it. It was happening right around when all the teams' mini camps were going on. Darren Rizzi on June 11th, after the mini camp practice, he gave about 15 minutes to the press where they talked about a lot of the stuff that we're about ready to talk about. But one of the things I think we have to do first is just kind of throw this up here, just make sure everybody is on the same page. And I'm only going to talk about 7 of the rules, kind of the setup and the important points of what we're probably going to see on a regular basis. There are finer points to the rules about certain situations that happen, even on onside kicks, stuff like that. I honestly don't know what most of those are, much less not going to really discuss it here. But the important things is you now have a landing zone, which is from the goal line to the 20 and sideline to sideline on the receiving team. It's the green box right there that says landing zone. Ball, when it's kicked off, must land in there. And the receiving team cannot call a fair catch. They must return it. So that landing zone or catch box and the fact that the receiving team has to catch it and can't fair catch it, well, we're going to see returns making a return, no pun intended, back to the NFL like we once were, because it really hadn't factored into, rarely, I shouldn't say not never, but rarely factored into your given NFL game what was going on returns. Now, in keeping with the landing zone, and it must land in it. So what happens if it lands short on the 21 or 22-yard line? That's the same thing as if the ball was kicked out of bounds. So it has to be inside the 20 and inside of both out of bounds markers. Otherwise, the ball is going to come out to the 40. Same thing as it has been forever with an out of bounds kick. It's just now short of the 20-yard line, short of that landing zone, is for all intents and purposes considered out of bounds. Now, on a ball kick past the goal line in that kind of pinkish area, just like a traditional touchback, it's a traditional touchback, but it's going to come out to the 30 instead of the 25. A ball that lands in that green landing zone and rolls into the end zone, it has to be down by the receiving team in the end zone, is also a touchback, but that comes out to the 20. So there's from the 40 to the 20, a very big swing of field position possibilities with this new rule and how it's going to be handled. The only other thing, really 3 things you need to touch up on is where's everybody else standing? The landing zone is either 1 or 2 returners. Everybody else is in this setup zone, which is basically foot on the 35-yard line of the receiving team. All but the kicker. The other 10 players on the kicking team are on the kickoff start line, which is the blue area, which is basically they have a foot on the 40-yard line. So it's really like a line of scrimmage is set up on the receiving team side of the field with a 5-yard neutral zone in between them. Kicker, nothing really changes for him on the kickoff as far as from where, because he's kicking from the 35. So this has led to some thoughts about new strategies coming in on how the kickoff is going to be handled compared to the way it used to be handled, just by virtue of the way this rule set is. Some of the things thrown out there that Darren Rizzi actually addressed. Kansas City special teams coach threw out position players as kickers because basically the thought process is more returns, and especially under this format where the kicker may have to be at least a safety, act as a safety valve in this whole thing, but may actually have to actively get involved in getting downfield and trying to tackle people. So thought was, well, you have a position player that can kick and he can get the ball where it needs to be, which is in the landing zone. That's an option instead of having your kicker or your punter do it. The types of kicks, that's been kind of batted around a little bit. and Rizzi kind of brings up like a line drive or a knuckleball kick, just basically not worried so much about having to get coverage downfield because they're starting off a lot closer. So just making sure he gets in the landing zone, and if you can some kind of way make it difficult for the receiving team to catch it instead of just a normal kick where they can get under it like they're used to. That was a thought process. And I don't think he talked about it, but I did see somewhere where people talking about too, trying to get their kickers to basically, lack of a better word, punt it. In other words, kick off the tee where they're getting it very high with a lot of hang time like a punt does, and trying to get in that landing zone because the receiving team can't fair catch it. They have to field it. So some very interesting concepts. And in the third thing we probably need to talk about, because he does too in here, is the prevailing thought is kind of circulating around that more and more starters are going to have to be used in coverage as blockers and as returners. So he spoke on that too at length. So when I initially saw this rule back in March when it came out, I was like, I don't think it's any big deal. It's nice that they're going to try to get returns back in. I don't know if this is the right way to do it, but at least it's something. That was kind of my attitude, because I wasn't expecting to have kind of some of the issues and topics and all that Rizzi and the media talk about in that. And that's really what I'm going to focus on this. So I'm not going to show you the whole interview, but I would suggest it's about 15, 16 minutes long. Go and find it on YouTube. It's on the New Orleans Saints YouTube channel, and that's the version I'm going to show you. Go watch it, because he really takes a very deep dive into special teams as far as the new kick return rule, how it's going to happen, how it's going to affect them as far as they know, and some things they just don't know because nobody's ever done it before, and also how it's important to the team. It could change philosophy slightly. It would almost definitely change some game management situations when you're talking maybe kicking off at the end of a quarter or even at the end of a game. With Darren Rizzi, special teams coordinator, and he's going to touch on a lot of topics. And I've kind of edited through this entire video. It's about 15, 16 minutes long. It comes from the New Orleans Saints YouTube channel. If you have any interest in special teams or any interest in trying to figure out what's going on with the new rule with a deep dive from a guy who really knows what he's talking about, you're probably going to want to watch the whole thing. But I'm just going to clip out just a couple of Q&As that kind of cover some of the stuff we're talking about from the overall big picture.
Now, listen, I saw those comments by Coach Tobe, who's a close personal friend. So, I understand the theory of maybe putting a position player back there. Here's the problem with that. The issues arise because the placement of the kick with the new rules is at a premium. And so if you have a position player that can really place the ball, then absolutely that could be a benefit to you. The problem is the risk reward of getting a bad kick, because the penalty for getting a bad kick is really, really high.
So, one of the things we talked about that this new rule that, and he mentioned the coach's special teams coach in Kansas City was the one who brought up, well, if you got a position player that can kick and handle the kickoffs, that's a good thing, because since it's promoting returns and it's very likely to elicit a lot of returns, well, we're probably going to need that 11th defender safety type guy back there. And so you got a position player safety, and I think specifically they're talking about Justin Reed, who's actually been their emergency kicker before and kicked extra points and field goals, as being the guy that does it. And Rizzi saying, yeah, it's a great idea in theory, but there's a risk reward. And he talks a lot about the risk reward and all this, risk reward, because you get penalized pretty severe for not kicking the ball in the appropriate zone that you're supposed to, or at least kicking it all the way through and getting a touchback.
With the new rules, because if, the other day we were out here practicing, and obviously if the ball goes out of bounds, the ball goes to the 40. If the ball lands short of the 20, it goes to the 40. So if a position player mishits the ball and say it lands on the 21-yard line, the drive start's going to start at the 40. So it sounds great in theory, and I've heard a lot of coaches talk about maybe some alternative kicks, some line drives, because obviously the hang time's irrelevant. Got it. Maybe some knuckleball types of kicks, and listen, we're like everybody else. We've taken a look at all that stuff too. Again, it's going to be a risk reward. It might be a situational thing for me to sit here and think that someone's going to do that 100% of the time. I think that's a little bit aggressive, if you will.
So it goes a little further in some of the other topics of conversation that we mentioned earlier. It's like, oh, well, you're going to need a kicker to knuckleball it down there, or, just go ahead and kick a line drive, because coverage really isn't an issue. The cover guys are starting closer, and there's that 5-yard neutral zone in between the cover team and the blocker. So, they're not going to really have a problem covering the kicks. So knuckleball is an option, or the high pooch kick, pooch punt. He doesn't address that, but I've read that in other places being, if you get a guy to sky a ball, say around the 5-yard line, yeah, you might be able to really pin him back. And he's saying, whoa, there's a very severe penalty that if you screw this up, they're getting the ball in the 40. So you don't want that. And he even brings up, well, situationally, you maybe would do it, but he's of the opinion, no, aggressively do it every time. Not really on board with that, because again, the risk versus the reward. Do we really need to do that every time? But situationally, he does acknowledge, as part of the new strategy this is developing.
And again, I say that because the field position is going to be the premium. Again, if you hit a touchback, a regular touchback, ball in the air, lands in the end zone, it's coming to the 30, the ball hits the ground, skips in, touchback, it's going to the 20. To run the risk of a team starting at the 40-yard line with this new rule is just something that I think is going to be maybe tried out in the preseason. I think, listen, more than ever before, these preseason games are going to be really fun to watch from a special team standpoint.
If you kick it wrong, you can give them the ball in the 30 instead of, as a conventional touchback, that's where it's being placed now, instead of the 25, a little more premium field position. You screw it up, it's going to be on the 40, a lot more premium field position. So situational and experimentally, yeah, maybe. And then he brings up preseason, going, very important. And he touches on this a couple of times in the interview, of going, look, all this new strategy involved, we've never done it before. We're almost a trial and error phase that we're going to have to do in the preseason once things start getting live, to kind of see what it looks like, what we can do, what can't do, what may work, what we won't work. And he expounds on that quite a bit later on in the Q&A here. But literally, he's 1-2 questions, and in the first 3, 4, 5 minutes of this, he's covered a tremendous amount of ground about how important this new rule and the effects it's going to have on the team and itself in preparation and trying to figure all this out. And then the reality of the effects of it once the season starts. Now, he gets asked on another topic here about using more starters in the special teams, especially involved in the kick return. He was asked specifically about using Taysom or Alvin more, and he starts out addressing that, but then he goes a little further in his explanation, kind of unraveling a little more of what's really going on in all this.
With the way the new rule is, because it's really lowered the injury risk, and now it has essentially become the first play of offense and the first play of defense. I think your whole roster is available to you. And listen, some of it might be situational. You might not use Alvin Kamara 100% of the time, but Alvin Kamara is probably going to be back there at some point, back there lined up at return, And AK and I have had that conversation. Same thing with defensive players. You might not have defensive starters out there every single kickoff, but if you're kicking off at the end of a game and you have a pretty good idea they're going to return the ball, you may have 2 or 3 of your defensive starters out there, which you didn't have those guys in the past. And so, as you start to think through all the different things and the different way it changes the game, think about the end of a half, right? At the end of a half in the past, if there was 4 seconds left, you could squib kick it and kind of, run out the half, if you will. You can't do that anymore. The clock doesn't start until the ball touches a player. The ball's got to make it to the landing zone on a fly. And so, what do you do in those situations? Do you kick a touchback? Do you kick a layup down there in the setup zone and let them return to get the time off the clock? So a lot of those game management situations are also going to be very, very different. I think that's probably a little bit one of the under the radar things that's coming along with this new rule is that some of those end of the game situations and scenarios are going to be interesting. A team scores with 2 seconds left to take the lead, whether it's a field goal or a touchdown. All right, well, you can't just kick a little dribbler and end the game. You've got to put the ball down there in the landing spot, so the game's essentially not over. And so I think some of those end of the game situations are going to be much more exciting than they were in the past. And I
actually had to cut him off there because he keeps going, but he just threw a lot of information out there. And honestly, when this rule came out in March, I kind of ho-hummed it going, my honest opinion at the time was, yeah, I really want to see more returns. I get they had some safety concerns because they were really getting some serious injury and high levels on the kickoff return. But at the same time, it's football. So I kind of went back and forth on it. It just seemed hokey to me. But one of the things I took away from it is the return game has gone away in kick returns, and it's one of the most exciting plays in pro football. I miss watching guys like Devin Hester, or in the Saints vernacular, guys like Tyrone Hughes or Michael the Beerman Lewis, kind of an electrifying kickoff return, and that could end in a score, best case scenario, get massive field position flip, pump up the crowd. You've just given up a touchdown, and all of a sudden you kick off, and this guy who can run and return and is electric suddenly fires the crowd back up, even though the defense gave up 7, not more than 3 or 4 minutes ago. So it's all kind of important. Then he really rolls into it, talking about even game management and strategy at the end of the game. And this is, I really hadn't thought about this. Going, well, what do you do? The way the rules are structured, you have to kick it. Well, where do you kick it? What do you do with it? How much time's left on the clock? 4 or 2 seconds doesn't seem like a lot. But if you screw this up, you give him the ball in the 40. Think of, we got to play Patrick Mahomes this year, for example. Well, we're up 6. We screw up the kickoff. They're spotting it on the 40. I'm pretty sure Mahomes can zing one down there and put you in a Hail Mary situation you probably don't want to be in. And under the old rules, like you say, you just squib it down there. You're able to run they have to come up with some crazy exotic return with the rules basically set up to not allow returns. It was almost a gimme. It was a layup. We're going to win the game. So all we got to do is squib it down there. Not so much anymore. Now there's a premium of kicking the ball in the right place. So now, and when he started it off, he said, we're viewing this as the first play on offense and defense. It's like almost taking it out the realm of special teams because now you have such a great high chance of a return in more of a line of scrimmage situation because you're lining up, on the 40 and the 35 with a neutral zone in between them on the returner side of the field. So it kind of has a point there. So not even using your top athletic return guy or players to return, but also talking about using starters. And he didn't even say specifically, you may have a situation in that late game scenario when you're kind of looking at it, it's like, this is an offense versus defensive thing. Is it possible you're going to see a bunch of the starting offensive linemen out there if you're going, look, we only have 4 seconds left and we've got to get a return into the end zone for any chance to win this game? And it kind of sets up more like an offensive versus defensive play than the original kickoff special teams we're used to seeing. Again, to me, it's kind of hokey, but it's interesting, and it's opened up a lot of, clearly he's talking about a lot of different strategies and takes that nobody's really ever seen this before, so they're not really sure how it's going to play out, and it is a high degree of uncertainty. But it can be a lot of excitement, or like NFL rule changes typically are, it could be a total shit show.
Something we haven't thought about. So, I'll give you guys one. You guys have seen the rule before on the sideline where if a player goes over to the sideline and gets a foot out of bounds and touches the ball's essentially out of bounds. Well, that's something that no one's thinking about. That's now the same with the 20-yard line across the field. So if I'm a player and back one of the returners and I get myself up over the 20-yard line and touch the ball, I'm out of bounds. That ball's going to the 40-yard line. Something we've never, ever, ever seen before. And so those are because the 20-yard line will be officiated just like the out-of-bounds line. So essentially you now have a third out-of-bounds line added to the field on kickoffs. So there's going to be a lot of things that deal with that 20-yard line that we've never, ever seen in the NFL ever before. And so that's going to be a really interesting aspect of it.
Um, so there you go. I mean, he's literally talking about something that, and he was part of the committee that made this rule. And it kind of sounds like he was one of the leading voices behind it. And he's kind of throwing at you like, hey, something nobody's thought of. So I'm inferring, I'm taking that as when we were coming up with this rule, we didn't really think about it, but we've discovered it since that you've now added a third component to the, as he explained, the old I'm inbounds, out of bounds, touching the ball. So all of a sudden it's a penalty on the kicking team, even though technically the receiver was catching the ball in bounds. We've all seen that trick happen before. Well, what he's saying, you can do the same thing now on the 20 and 21-yard line and get the same result on a kick that's actually in the middle of the field and more than likely would wind up in the landing zone where it's legally supposed to. And they can play the little game where nope, we can touch it where we're standing outside the landing zone and just like touching it while we're in bounds and it's out of bounds. Same scenario, boom, now it's at the 40. You've just had a large jump in field position, putting the defense in a bad spot. He goes on a little later. We're going to kind of stop it right there. I think you kind of getting the idea of when we were talking about, all the, not only the actual rules, but how it's going to impact the game. Teams are going to have to do strategies to adopt to a new rule, and a new rule that they're not really 100% sure what it's going to look like, to the point where in the last, I don't know, 4 or 5 years, it seems like nobody wanted to deal with preseason games. And now you got a coach going, yeah, we're going to kind of need those things because we really need to see what's going to be happening and going on. Even further explanation that he goes, if again, I suggest you really watch this video. There's really some knowledge and great stuff in there. But he goes on further on to even talk about that what he thought going into mini camps and OTAs, that, how he thought things were going to look, he thought they were going to do things, suddenly became, at one point, he said, no, I hate that. No, we're not doing that. And then seeing something else and going, oh yeah, that can stay. And like I mentioned earlier, he goes into a deeper dive about how much more, mentioned a little bit in that clip about the meetings and having to explain everything and make sure all the players are on board with what's going on and needing to understand it. But the amount of practice time they now have to put in on the field, because basically everything's changing. So it's everybody's in a new, players, coaches, everything, just a whole entirely new environment when it comes to kick and kick returns. So there you have it. The very shallow end of the deep dive that Rizzi was, Coach Darren Rizzi was giving us on the new kick return rules. One thing I noticed that when I shot the previous segment, I totally forgot to update the trailer at the bottom to give credit to the video source. It was not whoever I had listed on the bottom. That was an old video. It's actually the YouTube site of the New Orleans Saints. And for the last time, I do suggest really go watch the whole thing and get everything that Rizzi has to say. So this is my question on whether or not I got some thumbs up, guys. Are you excited at least to see the possibility of explosive kickoff returns regularly coming back into the NFL as a result of this rule? I could live with the rule change if that's the result we get. It's like a Bub Means is somebody that's coming to mind for me, is if he is a Michael Beerman Lewis type back there, where it's just electric when he can get the ball back there and what he can do to teams trying to cover a kick. Again, I really feel like the whole thing is gimmicky, hokey, the way they're trying to go about doing it, but we'll see. And let me know in the comments how you feel about it one way or the other. Um, I, I, I don't know. I guess we'll just have to see it. Preseason, maybe we'll get a taste of it and we can get a little better up, because we're in the same boat as he's saying, as the coaches and the players and everybody else. really hadn't been done the way that they're going to try to do it. A little different from the XFL. So nobody's seen it yet. Nobody knows what to expect. We'll see. But I'm hoping the electricity of the kickoff return getting back into the NFL. So that's it. That's all we got for today. Glad you could join us. Till the next time we see each other, I'm Tim. Peace out and who dat.